Most women who menstruate dread the pain they experience during the first few days of their periods. It is during these days that the stomach cramps get unbearable, and all that the body wants to do is curl up on a cozy bed. Turns out that historically, many communities around the world had spatialized this bodily function and integrated it within their architecture in the form of menstruation huts, often leading to the isolation and oppression of women as impure beings. Our guest today offers a slightly different perspective to look at the menstruation rooms. She argues that these spaces in the West African Benin Kingdom were intentionally designed for women to rest and recuperate. The isolation rooms were basically spas. So, with the support of the Graham Foundation for Advanced Studies in the Fine Arts, we have with us today fellow Graham grantee artist Minne Atairu. I am Vaishnavi Shukla and this is Architecture Off Center, a podcast where we highlight contemporary discourses that shape the built environment but do not occupy the center stage in our daily lives. We speak to radical designers, thinkers, and changemakers who are deeply engaged in redefining the way we live and interact with the world around us.
Let's just start with the absolute basics, because this is something that I had to educate myself on, and I'm sure not a lot of people know about it. But if you could just tell a little bit about, give an elevator pitch history on the Benin Kingdom, its people, its social hierarchy, its architecture. I know that's a loaded question, but just shed some light.
Okay. Yeah, so the Benin Kingdom is a pre-colonial West African state that existed until about the late 19th century when the British Empire colonized the area. But prior to colonization, the kingdom was centered around the monarch, who is known as an Oba, and Oba is a Benin word for king. And so it was such a centralized power system where he had control over every facet of society. And so where the Benin Bronzes come in is he was also in the art making space. He was also considered the sole commissioner of the arts, particularly if you were producing something in a material that was not common to the land or was not native to the land. And so the Benin Bronzes, the bronzes that were used to make the Benin Bronzes, most of them were imported into Benin. Some of them were purchased from communities around the West African coast, and then later on, as trade expanded in Benin Kingdom, we started collecting and purchasing from the Portuguese. And so once the Oba purchased these the bronze material, he would store it in his palace, basically a storage. And that was the only way as an artist that you would get access to the material bronze to then make a bronze item. And so that's how the Oba monopolized, particularly the making of items in bronze. But later on, fast forward into the future towards the colonial era, we were also producing palm products, which was in high demand in Europe at the time because it was the industrial era as well. And so it was high in demand for soap making, production, margarine, machine lubrication as well. But because, as I mentioned earlier, the king monopolized every facet of society, including trade, he would open and close markets whenever he wished. He would raise taxes whenever he wished. And it was not a very conducive, space to do trade, especially if you were traveling all the way from Britain, which is not an excuse for colonization, because we know the reality of colonialism is extraction, especially without paying communities, colonized community. And so because it was, as the British say, very difficult to do trade, a lot of other things happened. Eventually, the British Empire sent an army to invade Benin, colonize the kingdom, torch the palace, depose the king, exile the king, stole over 4,000 objects, which were later exported to Europe, sold to various institutions and private collectors, the largest collector of the Benin Bronze we know today is the British Museum, which we talked about earlier. And then from there, it was also distributed to other institutions across the world. So at least 160 museums across the world have one Benin Bronze. And it may not be like, you know, a full-on sculpture. It could just be like, because it was just like, it's weird the kind of things they collected. Some institutions just have like scraps. It's just like a scrap of metal, but they collect it anyway. So that counts as a Benin Bronze, and yeah.
So we're actually here to talk about something very fascinating that's part of your research project within the Benin Kingdom. And since this season focuses on broadly the themes of care and health and, you know, contextualizing it within the larger discourse of what we as a society, you know, look at as beyond just like healthcare as one word or medicine or whatever. Your particular project, which is also funded by the Crime Foundation, is looking at the menstruation isolation rooms or menstruation huts. And the moment I read your proposal, it struck a chord, because this is something we are familiar with as well in India, because a lot of traditional Indian societies, a lot of tribal settlements, even till date, have menstruation huts for women. And this is something, I mean, of course, as time goes and as generations are no longer around us, the idea is becoming a little more obsolete. But in the most rural parts of India, they still have communal menstruation huts. Now, for people who don't know what menstruation huts are, these are essentially huts or rooms which are typically constructed out of the house, of the main house, or at a community level outside of the main settlement or dwelling places, where women who are menstruating for whatever 5 to 7 days a week go and live in, because of whatever ideas of the societies back then, whether it has to do with menstruating women being impure, or, you know, them being considered as polluting or whatever that is. But this is something that you found in your primary research, something that existed even within the Benin Kingdom. So what was that about, and how did you just come across this?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I was researching architecture in Benin, something very unrelated to like menstruation huts. But then I came across this paper, which I sent to you, and I saw this little diagram showing a chief's, like just the design of a chief's house in pre-colonial Benin, and the menstruation hut that women would usually isolate during their period. So that's how the research started. But a primer. So in Benin Kingdom, at least every Benin woman, once you start menstruating, there's this law. We know that if you are menstruating or a woman, you probably don't want to go, and this is like our primer, go to the king's palace, because they say there's a part of the king's palace that if you access, then you will continue to menstruate forever. But it's just a way of preventing women from like circulating the king's, you know, space. So that's where it's all started for me.
What I found more interesting in the way you describe it is quite contrary to the way it is perceived, right? So in India, even if you read a lot of literature on menstruation huts or menstruation room, it has to do with terrible living conditions. In fact, there are reports of Indian women being bit by snakes in tribal areas and actually dying of snake bites, because these menstruation huts don't have the kind of infrastructure that is conducive to healthy living, at least during those few days. The way you look at it was quite radical, and I was like, maybe there's some stuff to dig here, because you said these are actually places of self-care, and the way you frame it is almost like these spaces had a potential of, I don't know, like fostering a certain kind of sisterhood of sorts, or really looking at these rooms or menstruation huts as potential places of acting as a spa. what is that about? I mean, it's a thought exercise, I know, but
yeah. It's a research in progress. So the first diagram I found, and so far what I know about menstruation huts in the Benin context, is that they aren't structures that live outside of the family complex. They're built into the living space, but then the living space itself is sectioned into a woman's quarters, and then the menstruation hut is then placed towards the end. So every Benin like architectural complex will have like the front entrance and the back entrance, especially for the women to access the hut when they're menstruating, so they don't have to go through the front. But I was also very interested in the menstruation hut as a spa, because in Benin, like, women aren't, and I guess this is the case for a lot of communities, that in pre-colonial times, or what we know about the literature we read, which is not written by us, but by someone else, is that women were isolated, they were not active participants in politics, and much of their life is dedicated to caring for the family and cooking and cleaning and wiping after men. But during this time of menstruation, they are then not required to do all of that housework. This gives them time to themselves, to commune and convene and to think and to just care for yourself. Like, it's during that period that you're braiding your hair. It's during that period that you really have time to just be you without the burden of the patriarchy.
And this is something I mean, I was very young, and, you know, when puberty hits and you have your first period, you know, it's, in a lot of Indian culture, it's almost like a moment of celebration, you know, when the family or your mother would usually like, okay, now you're not a girl, you're a woman now. And I remember having this conversation, I think it was with my mother a long time ago. She used to mention how in those few days of the month, a lot of Indian households have like shrines and temples, right? So where you go and pray, that women are not allowed to enter those sacred spaces in the house, or even for that matter, use the kitchen during those few days. And her way to talk about this was to kind of justify and include this as part of an overall myth making, where by creating these barriers, much like what you said, creating these barriers to entry into certain spaces, or actually creating or carving out time for women to rest. Because I mean, well, let's agree, all the earlier, like, older societies were places, and households were places where women were restricted to domestic work. And limiting their entry into these spaces, you were limiting the work that they had to do, and allow them to get rest during those periods. And it made me, I mean, I was thinking about that while preparing for our talk today. It's like, okay, maybe there had to be a little bit of myth making in order to ensure that the purpose of these menstruating huts as places for self-care, or as spas, like you mentioned, that could be made possible. I'm not sure if in your research till now, if there has been any evidence of self-care, or of, I don't know, testimonials where people said yes, like they did get the time off during those few days of the week. Or I don't know what the physical infrastructure of menstruating huts really looked like in the...
Right. And that's what my research is about. I haven't traveled to Nigeria yet, so I'm going to Nigeria to see if there are any existing huts, what they look like, what implements or tools that women might have used, and what that tells us about self-care within that space.
Are there any that are existing right now?
I am not sure. I'm not sure, probably in more of the rural areas, because they are, for example, the diagram that you saw, that building is still in existence because they try to preserve it. So I'm sure the hut is there, but I don't know if the women use it.
And what exactly, so just to talk about your methodology a little bit, so you've done a little bit of archival research. What does fieldwork look like?
Field work involves visiting first the house of the chief that's still in place, and it was built during the pre-colonial era. So we know that the house of menstruation is still in existence. So visiting there to see what that space looks like, if there are any implements or tools, and if the chief, because the chief still lives in the structure, so to ask his wives if they still use it. And I'm sure there's a lot to learn from them, even if they don't, because they have, you know, intergenerational knowledge and whatever oral history exists in that space.
So it does involve a lot of oral history. Are there, I don't know, like any direct descendants of the king that are still alive? I don't know.
Oh yeah, we still have, so the Alba is still, like the monarchy is still very much alive and well, and it was reconstituted in 1914. That's 14 years after the exile of the king. They had to reconstitute the monarchy because Benin was such a complex political system prior to colonialism, and they found that it was very difficult to work with the British mode of like operating the kingdom, so they had to restore the monarchy. So yes, the king is still there. But that's the problem. So I mentioned earlier that I can't, or at least my dad would just lose his mind if I attempted to go into the king's palace because of this myth we had about women accessing the palace and the fact that you would menstruate for the rest of your life if you do. And so that prevents women from just, I don't know what it is. I've never been to the palace for that reason. Only men are allowed to go there.
Oh, like in all of the palace?
And the men, I have never been because of this.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, because they say, we don't know where the exact location is of this space where if a woman stepped upon, she would menstruate for the rest of her life. So you probably shouldn't go in to the gates.
I would love if somebody could, like, you know, if we could dig into how the story or this legend came about, because it seems like it has, I mean, there's a lot of things that could happen if you go into a forbidden place, right? Like, but the fact that you could menstruate for the rest of your life if you entered a palace just seems very, very specific.
Yeah, so I mean, ideally, if as a woman you wanted to access the palace, you probably want to have maybe a princess or whoever, other women who live there, so they can direct you towards the path that's not forbidden. That would be a way for you to access it. And I don't believe in all of these things, but it just makes my family feel, you know, better. And so everybody doesn't go berserk if I, you know, do something crazy. But also to respect the culture, because I think that's important, regardless of what my beliefs are.
I mean, up until I really read up on this and dug back into how it was so ingrained even in the Indian culture, and then once I got in, it seems like it's a fair part of a lot of Southeast culture. So you have menstruation huts up in the northeast of India. You have some in Nepal. A lot of them still active and alive in rural areas. But up until there, I never really connected the idea of menstruation as something that would have an implication and manifest itself as a physical space, right? I could never connect the idea of like female health to architecture. And then suddenly when you look at menstruating huts, you're like, oh, I mean, there was a way that somebody created a space that directly correlated to women's health and thought of, I don't know, how do you say, like constructing it, like not just metaphorically, but like physically constructing a space. And I don't think it's, even to think about in like modern day and age seems obtuse, because you have like women menstruating day in and out. But apart from like a sanitary disposal bin in the women's washroom, there's not much that you see as, I'm sure there there's stuff, but I just don't know about it. Like, I don't know what the current modern day healthcare discourse is on menstruation. I don't, do you know of anything that comes like as a contemporary equivalent?
Not much. Just basically what you said. But like something I wanted to point out also about my research, because I'm also very interested in looking at other knowledge systems, is that in colonized communities, especially somewhere like Benin, which is a case I'm studying, a lot of what we know about ourselves are written by the people who colonized us, right? Or are written by foreign researchers who came to Benin with this sense that if a woman is isolated in a room, she's an oppressed woman. And so that room is basically a prison, or whatever else is it could look like to, say, a Westerner who sees someone being locked up in a space as a prison, whereas in our way of, just in our knowledge system, it could be the opposite. And so what are other ways of thinking? That's where it also started. What are other ways of thinking about the menstruation hut that has not been written by a Western researcher or has not been hinted at in another, literature? Because not much is known about the hut. If I continue to apply these theories that exist in other centers, especially in the West, to a place that they don't fully understand, and to a culture that they don't actually believe in, and that a culture that they've tried to wipe away for such a long time, then how much can we truly know about ourselves? And that's why I'm going to the field to do more oral history, to visit the sites and start thinking of writing about it based on what I can find.
Yeah, so based on empirical evidence rather than colonial narration. I love it because there's been plenty of stuff written on colonizing black and brown bodies, right? On how they were used for labor in India, of course, used for farming, cultivation of opium and anything, like right from cotton to grains to everything. And of course, US has a history of using the black body in the fields. What I did not, okay, now it makes sense. What I did not think about was even the way history is written from that colonial lens runs the risk of portraying the female body and its functions as something that is perpetually oppressed, and not giving it the chance to be seen as something that is in fact working in the benefit of women. That is very interesting. It's almost subaltern in a certain way that you no I did not connect the points. Like, I did not think of it as something that could have been a colonial construct. You take it as it is, right, until you start questioning it. So I would really be interested in seeing how this changes and how this shapes up once you've done your field work. It's almost like you're going
done more work
against no but also when you're looking at it against the grain rather than taking it top down as somebody's reading of a space that exists. But if I were to push you a little bit more and just think through it almost as like a positive-ish, like optimistic Black Mirror view, if we had to look at menstruation huts or menstruation rooms today or in the future, what do you think they could look like? Do you think spaces like these have the potential to exist in our day-to-day lives, or do you think it's an infrastructure of the past and that it's something that just will be found in texts and historical UNESCO sites, as like, oh, when you're going on a tour, you show a tourist like, oh, this used to be a menstruation pass, something that doesn't exist anymore?
I mean, I think like during my period, I think I have at least like 24 or 48 hours of just like rolling in my bed and being lazy and losing my mind because I'm in so much pain. And it would be nice to have a space where other menstruating women, I don't know how that would function in reality, but people who are experiencing the same, I don't know, cramps, where could we gather and how could we convene and just ease our pain and I don't know, live through this natural phase of being a woman. I do see it in the future. It's possible. I just don't know how it would operate, but it's possible. I know sometimes when I'm at work and I'm having cramps and my colleague is having cramps and we're just there drinking coffee and talking about it. I mean, it would be nice to have like a much larger space with a registration system where you could go when your period starts, maybe the first 2 days when you're losing your mind. Yeah.
I love it. It's like it's a startup idea right there. Like creating a sorority or sisterhood of just
Right.
like people who menstruate, you know, whatever body they live in. But yeah, why not? Last question, since you're going to go on your field study, what does the future of the project look like, and what is the potential outcome of this research? If you've given it any thought, no pressure.
I mean, the research is interdisciplinary. It's like this intersection of architecture and also researching, doing object research. So when I learn more about the menstrual hut as an architecture and as a space that women used, you know, to care for themselves, what objects from the Benin Bronze collection, particularly the domestic objects that most museums don't have information about, that are just simply labeled as cups and bowls and very random names, generic names, that we don't quite understand what they were used for. So how can we associate those domestic items within the Benin Bronze corpus to the menstrual room? So that we can better understand domestic items in the Benin Bronze corpus. Because if you don't know much about the Benin Bronze corpus, Benin Bronzes is just, it's an art historical category that refers to these objects that were stolen. Most items in the objects are not actually in the collection are not actually made of bronze. It's made of, the items made of wood, terracotta, iron, copper, various items. And so, especially items that are not made in bronze, not much is known about the non-bronze items, particularly the domestic ones. I'm very interested to understand how women use those domestic items in the menstrual hut, if it was even used.
Well, I think maybe we'll have part 2 to this episode once you've done your field work. But I really just wanted to get the conversation started, because while you're looking at health and care and notions of both, it's difficult to not talk about female health, like whether it's reproductive health and part of it, of course, is, you know, menstruating health of people. And so it just seemed like such a direct connection between the body and a space beyond just using a washroom, you know, as a space that was just like carved out for a specific reason, for rest, for recuperation, for just like being at ease. So thank you for getting the conversation started, I must say that.
You're welcome, and thank you for inviting me to your podcast.
Yeah, and thank you, the Graham Foundation, for making this happen.
Special thanks to Ayushi Thakur for the research and design support, and Kahan Shah for the background score. You can follow us on Instagram at arcofcenter and reach out to us through our website arcofcenter.com. That is ARCHOFFCENTRE. And thanks for listening.